Why can we develop a vaccine for COVID in 8 months, but still don't have a vaccine for other viruses that are decades old? HIV is a highly mutagenic virus. There are a handful of different COVID strains circulating around the world. But in HIV, the virus continues to mutate readily after infection, leading to the presence of multiple strains per individual. This makes it a much more difficult task to come up with an effective vaccine for HIV. As for the others, it's more of an economic reason than a biological one. The scale of the COVID pandemic has caused governments and industry worldwide to pour money into the development of a vaccine, and that level of demand just isn't there for RSV/EBV/etc. Would love for someone with more of a background in healthcare economics to chime in here. I also want to throw out that the COVID vaccine is not simply the product of 8 months of work. Tons of work on other similar viri, like SARS, had already been done. And we've been working on the mechanics/production of mRNA-based vaccines for a long while too. To a degree, we got lucky with COVID in that it behaved similar to things we already understood, and that we've been working on mRNA-based vaccines for such a long time already. Even if it was just 8 months of work, it was 8 months of work from a literal army of scientists from basically every developed country in the world working towards the exact same goal. There is a huge reason why the COVID vaccine was able to be developed so quickly that I disturbingly don't see in other responses. For vaccine approval, efficacy must be proved when the incidence of a disease is low. This takes a much longer time to prove when the incidence of a disease is high. A vaccine can prove efficacy much more quickly. It should be noted that incidence and prevalence are close to equal in COVID-19. The 3 major reasons the vaccine has come out so quickly: 1. COVID-19 had a high incidence worldwide. 2. COVID-19 has a low mutation rate. 3. COVID-19 has no 100% effective prevention. Yes, affecting countries with more financial power is contributing, but that is not the primary reason. This is a silver lining of the US's severe infection rates. Lots of available data for the vaccine efficacy. Additionally, everything COVID-related was prioritized. I work in a malaria research lab, and unlike COVID-19, where all virus particles have the spike protein that we can teach our bodies to recognize with a vaccine, malaria has 60 different unique proteins they put on the surface of cells, making it way more impractical to get a vaccine that will broadly give you protection. Also, for reasons we don't completely understand, the immune system is less effective at developing immunity to some diseases. For example, even adults who have lived in malarious areas all their lives can still get low levels of malaria infection, and malaria immunity can drop off fast once you move to malaria-free regions and are no longer exposed, as little as 6 months. So we also have to figure out how to get a malaria vaccine to produce more effective immunity than repeated infections with the disease itself, which is a big hurdle. Different viruses have different defenses against the immune system, making them harder or easier to target. HIV, for example, has a glycan shield of sugars surrounding it that sort of blurs/masks it to the immune system. And which parts of it are glycosylated differs between strains that mutate, like the other user posted. HIV also hides latently inside immune cells, making it really hard to target. You'd have to destroy all those immune cells. Most difficult targets like HIV, Ebola, etc., that have been around for a while are really good at hiding from our immune system in a variety of ways, whereas COVID doesn't seem to be. There are many labs working on them with lots of highly motivated smart scientists, although the sciences are underfunded, and even HIV could use more money, but it's difficult. Think of all the other things we have vaccines for though. Most things we can develop vaccines for. And we're getting faster and faster at it, not just because of funding, but also improved wet lab techniques. So it's really that a small proportion of targets are very difficult and stick around as unsolved diseases. Generally, we have not had success vaccinating for viruses that form a chronic infection. HSV1/2, HIV, mono, Hep C, Epstein-Barr, etc. We have a vaccine for chickenpox, but we actually give you a weakened version of chickenpox that forms a lifelong infection in you as a vaccine. So, all we really do is skip the acute phase of the virus. That's right. You have chickenpox for life. It's likely we could make a similar vaccine for Epstein-Barr that would give you the lifelong infection without the acute phase of the illness. But they just haven't yet. HPV and Hep B can form a chronic infection, but they typically don't. This is why we have vaccines for them now too. There are many types of viruses that employ different methods to evade the immune system. COVID-19 has a particularly immunogenic coat protein. Certain viruses, HIV, cover themselves in our natural glycans, sugar molecules, making our immune system unable to bind to them. Others, rabies, exist within the nervous system, where our standard immune system can't reach. Or, EBV, fully integrate their genome into our cells and only emerge in an immunocompromised state. Study virology. It's awesome. Just as an FYI, there is a rabies vaccine. Either that, or my insurance got billed for a rabies vaccine and I got some very expensive shots. I often go hiking in areas where medical treatment might be unavailable for a few days. So the vaccine is a no-brainer for me. The vaccine for rabies helps fighting it in the bloodstream after a dog or a bat bite. If it reaches your nervous system, you are only left with the option of picking the type of wood for your coffin. I remember reading about the Milwaukee Protocol as a treatment for patients with advanced stage rabies, putting your body in a coma and then bombarding it with antivirals, but that it's very expensive and rarely actually works. Right. The Milwaukee Protocol has fallen out of fashion as a last-chance resort. No other cases have been published of it working except the original, and it's on its own far from risk-free, making it a difficult option ethically. Work was previously done on SARS viruses that are similar to COVID-19. The work previously on MERS helped researchers tremendously. The spike protein on COVID-19 has not changed. The other viruses that are difficult to get vaccines for are not SARS viruses. Many mutate too much. What makes a lot of viruses so hard to vaccinate against is how often they mutate. For example, the seasonal flu vaccine is basically a best estimation every year of which are going to be the worst that year. Some of the viruses that don't mutate quickly are the easy ones that you get vaccinated against once and are good for life. The faster mutating ones are just hard as heck to lock down. There were 33 cases in 2018 and 94 in 19, so I'm not sure what you're talking about. As far as I know, the only documented escape mutant of WPV1 is PV1RC 2010, which thankfully burned out. Otherwise, we've used the same polio vaccines for like 50 plus years now. Because there is rarely a clear incentive for the entire industry, regulators, and politicians to focus on one thing. Also, drugs are approved based on the benefits outweighing the risk. A global pandemic makes that an easier bar to clear. For a non-emergency situation, the FDA would, correctly, require longer-term safety and effectiveness data. For example, we know the vaccines are effective in the short term, but we don't know how long that effectiveness lasts. In a normal situation, you'd need that data before seeking approval. Longer-term safety and effectiveness data, surely this is even more important given the circumstances though. I mean, we don't want the solution to be worse than the pandemic itself. In an emergency, you care more about short-term results than long-term results. A brief summary of the key points. 1. Vaccines are made to mimic a person's immune response. Since no one has ever recovered from HIV, we can't mimic that. It's like if I asked you to mimic my great aunt's voice, you can't because you don't know what it sounds like. I don't even know what it sounds like. 2. Vaccines don't prevent infection. They just help protect against the disease. They're made to buy the body time to fight the infection and give the body the tools necessary to fight it. But HIV lays dormant in the body for a long time before it progresses to AIDS. And while it's dormant, it hides and reproduces in cells without anyone knowing. Then that means the body has to fight even harder to get rid of the infection completely, if it can find all the copies. 3. Most viruses that have vaccines enter through the gastrointestinal or respiratory systems. HIV primarily enters through the genitals or blood, which we have much less experience in fighting. Let alone making something to fight it for. HIV mutates too quickly. It's constantly changing and evolving. And we have no way to track those changes or predict when the next change will happen or what it will be. What's effective as a vaccine now? By the time appropriate testing is done, it might be useless. 5. Most commonly, a killed or weakened strain of a virus is used to develop a vaccine so that the body can learn to fight it off. However, in initial trials, a killed or weakened form of HIV was not effective and didn't produce an immune response. The standard form of the virus is too dangerous to use for these purposes. Also, there is the PrEP pill is also available to help the body prevent HIV. But it's a regularly taken pill, not a one-time shot vaccine, edited to add HIV. While it's been around and harming humans for a long time, was largely ignored until the 1980s because of its association with the LGBTQ+ people. I don't think your last paragraph is entirely accurate. We didn't become aware of HIV/AIDS until the 1980s. It wasn't ignored because of its association with LGBT until the 1980s. It was then ignored several years of the 80s because of that. Your wording makes it sound like we knew for decades before the 80s and then decided all of a sudden to do something. I apologize. My wording on that last bit was incorrect. Scientists have traced HIV/AIDS coming to the US to around 1970. But it didn't receive public attention until the 80s. Even after that though, it still took a long time for people to separate the disease from the unrelated LGBTQ+ community. In '82, it was called GRID, which stood for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. In '83, the public still related the two and called HIV/AIDS the gay plague for many years. I'd also like to add though that the disease has also been linked to a widespread pandemic in the DRC all the way back to 1920. So it is something that has been around for a while. Edited for grammar. It's hard to test for vaccines because you need enough people to catch the illness to power a study that actually proves a vaccine works. But they are easy to test now. That and a ton of funding. It's possible the mRNA technology will be used for other disease moving forward. Could be a great silver lining behind all this. We don't know yet if the immunity is lasting for this vaccine, but I sure hope so. I was on the trial and in Tier 1A to get vaccinated, so I personally can't wait for it, hopefully this week. Because of the scale of the virus involved, HIV/FE is a global health issue, but not a global health emergency. It probably caused more deaths than COVID, but not in the span of a single year. The more footprint a problem has in the public, the more pressure is there for politics to release funding, and for medical companies to prioritize. As well, it helps that SARS isn't a very complicated or entirely new strain of virus. In essence, COVID is just a very complicated and dangerous flu. High priority. Easy compared to, let's say, HIV to develop. That's why we get a vaccine relatively quick. Besides the great answers that some problems are harder to solve than others. If you have 1,000 labs working on something and billions invested into it, you tend to obtain results much quicker than when 2 labs are working on something with $1 million. There are lots of problems we could solve rather quickly if we put all of our human resources into it. I can think of 2 reasons, as viruses go. Coronavirus turns out to be fairly easy to vaccinate against. The spiky bits are easy to target. We started off already knowing that much because of past research done on other coronavirus strains. Second, consider the sheer amount of resources that have been dedicated to finding a vaccine. There are a lot of really smart people working on this. And they are very well funded. The outcome here was never in doubt. Edit, apparently viri is not a word. There's a few really relevant things to add to the conversation. COVID-19 is a very standard virus. It works exactly the way other common viruses work. It has a very convenient target for antibodies. Through the spike protein. This has stayed constant through the minor mutations around the world. COVID-19 vaccines are also being rushed through the regulatory processes. This is because of the impact on the global economy. This is just largely by cutting red tape by governments running their assessment and regulations concurrently with the trial process rather than waiting for trials to end. The mRNA vaccines are a little different. The process for developing these vaccines has been in progress for years. And with COVID, pharmaceutical companies have doubled and doubled down again on development, rolling out a supply chain that will be used for other vaccines in the future. Don't underestimate the amount of resources thrown against this. Furthermore, we have been successfully developing vaccines against coronaviruses for a while. This is just another iteration. Viruses that incorporate in the host DNA are a lot harder to tackle. For other viruses, there is no economical incentive to produce a vaccine and go over to wide vaccination. Just think about it for a bit. And it's actually quite logical. And I must stress that these are my personal thoughts on the subject. Not an expert opinion. 1. Developing vaccines is expensive. 2. Creating vaccines require test subjects. Not just animals, but also humans, to verify efficacy. And the reasons this is possible: 1. In the case of COVID, the economic incentive is massive. This means that it is possible to speed up development, since it is easy to get funding. With more funding, you can run several of the required steps in parallel. That's what has happened with the COVID vaccines. Nothing is left out. It's merely done in parallel, enabled by funding. 2. The virus is currently everywhere. And as morbid as it might sound, that means it's easier to verify efficacy. If you have a virus that only shows up here and there every now and then, it's really hard to verify your results quickly. But it is now possible to include thousands of people in the phase 3 testings really quickly. And you will have substantial data to work with as a result. So that's why. It's not that vaccines can't be developed quickly. It's just that, normally, you are not doing so under a global pandemic. By the nature of the technology, mRNA vaccines lend themselves to quick development. Much of the work for the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines is based on the vaccines for SARS and MERS that were already in development. They pivoted what they had and adapted it. Has nothing to do with money, other than the thought of profit and speeding up actual production. The vaccine was developed within hours of the released genome sequence. It just happened to be a very easy one to develop because of the lack of major mutations of the virus. I haven't seen this in the comments yet, so forgive me if I'm repeating something another Redditor has added, but a further part to this is the scale of manufacture. Normally any new drug/vaccine/ATMP, advanced therapeutic medicinal product, would go through 1 to 3 years of product development to define and optimize the production process. For these vaccines, we have been doing product development alongside large-scale manufacture. That doesn't compromise the vaccine itself in that there's substantial testing ensuring that it's safe/sterile/pure/ of a high enough efficacy. But it does mean manufacturing are being run ragged with last-minute changes, alterations to the process batch to batch, document errors and optimizations in real time. So some of the speed for these vaccines comes from a lot more work in manufacturing to adapt, almost in real time. to changes while troubleshooting and optimizing along the way. Source: I work for one of the manufacturers for one of the bigger candidate vaccines.